Hello, welcome to the podcast The Faithful. This is your host, Joseph Ramirez. Today I would like to discuss what was known as Liberation-Theology. So, Liberation-Theology was a political and spiritual movement within the Catholic Church in Latin America that began back in the 1950s, and it was very prevalent from the 1950s to the 1980s. It was a very controversial political movement within the Catholic Church, which was met by lots of opposition by governments. So to give a little context, the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, the main dominant religion is the Catholic Church. And so in the 19th century and the 20th century, the Catholic Church typically tried to be on good terms with the government. They wanted to be close in power with the governments, which at that time were very repressive military dictatorships. From Central America to South America and the Caribbean, there was many repressive dictators, such as Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and the Duvaliers in Haiti, and so forth. So the Catholic Church typically preferred ministering to the rich and the leadership of these countries. And in Latin America, in the 1800s and a lot of the 20th century, there was a lot of economic inequality. There was a small, rich elite, the landowner class, the rich elite who controlled industry and stuff. And then everybody else was mostly poor peasants, also called campesinos. There was really no middle class at the time. And there was a lot of social injustice in Latin American countries. A lot of the military dictatorships, alongside with the rich business elite, would exploit and repress the poor. And the Catholic Church, for the most part, was complacent and not really concerned about it up until the 1950s. In the 1950s, a new generation of clergy arose, and they were horrified by so many social injustices that they were seeing in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, Colombia, and so forth. And so liberation theology was born, and the original principles was focusing on ministering to the poor and giving them dignity, and no longer ostracizing them, but going to the poor and evangelizing to them. There was a strong emphasis in liberation theology on human rights and social justice. And these were very important things. And one thing that liberation theologians began doing was sometimes calling for accountability from governments, which were dictatorships, to stop human rights violations. And this disrupted the relationship between government and the Catholic Church. So more context was after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, a lot of the dictatorships in Latin America were on red alert. They were afraid of a domino effect of more communist revolutions occurring. There were many civil wars in Latin America followed the Cuban Revolution, such as civil wars in Colombia, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, Peru, and Nicaragua. And sadly, there were some Catholic clergy who started adopting some of the principles of Marxism in liberation theology. There were some Colombian priests, for example, in the 1960s who began becoming involved with Marxist guerrilla groups such as the ELN, the National Liberation Army in Colombia. And then also there's an example in Nicaragua, which was ruled by the Somoza family dynasty. They were a U.S.-friendly dictatorship which ruled Nicaragua. It was a family dynasty which ruled from the 1930s to 70s. The Catholic Church and the Somoza dynasty had a friendly relationship up until the 1970s, when the Catholic Church was horrified by the repression that the Somoza dictatorship was using to suppress all dissent. And so then the Catholic Church turned their support from the Somoza dynasty to the FSLN, the Sandinista guerrilla group, which were left-wing, and the Catholic Church began supporting them. And at this time, the United States government began becoming a major critic of liberation theology, accusing it of stoking Marxism and communist revolutions. Liberation theology began being rejected by the Vatican itself as dangerous. So there was those in liberation theology who had a good goal. They had good intentions, and then there were some who took it too far and got involved in left-wing guerrilla movements because they viewed it as their duty to perform justice, to go after the oppressors, to try to overthrow these dictatorships. And so, as a result, a lot of the whole Catholic Church, in some cases such as El Salvador, the entire Catholic Church became hated by the military dictatorship of El Salvador. In the 1980s, the Catholic Church as a whole began being persecuted by the military of El Salvador, and several nuns and priests began being murdered in the 70s and 80s in El Salvador, including even foreign missionaries from the United States. And so liberation theology began kind of fading away by the 1990s, when Latin America began transitioning to democracies in the 1980s and 90s, and the civil wars began coming to an end. And liberation theology seemed less relevant when there was more of economic integration in a lot of Latin American countries, where middle classes started rising and civilian governments started coming to power and dictatorships ended. Liberation theology began fading away. So it left a mixed legacy, and it was twisted and exploited from good intentions.